Welcome back to the Blazor Server In-Depth course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at some advanced forms or advanced things to do in forms. Okay, so we've covered the basics of how forms works. We've covered how validation works. But you and I know that the reality is that when you get into the real world, you're going to come across some more advanced scenarios. It's not just going to be fill out a few text boxes and have a checkbox. There's going to be a lot more to it. And so in this video, we're going to kind of go over what are some advanced things you can do with forms. And maybe if we don't cover every scenario, we'll cover enough so you can see how you would do that other scenario as well. So let's go to Visual Studio and we will create a new project, a Blazor app, and call it Blazor app. And this is Advanced Forms Demo. We'll make sure that all the settings are correct, and they are. We hit create. And once we're done, we should have our Blazor app, and we do. So now let's talk through creating a more advanced form. Let's start by creating a model that will support our advanced form. And we may add to this model if we need more things, but we're going to start with a sample model that just has basic stuff in it. We're not going to try and set up a scenario with this. I just want to give you examples of the different types so you have, here's how exactly to do each of these different things. Okay? So let's start by creating a few properties. We're going to start with an integer and we'll call this sample int. And then we'll have a double and say sample double. And then we'll have a bool and we'll say sample bool. And it'll have a date time. We'll say, sample date. And then I think what we'll do is we'll create one more value for now. And we're going to come back and modify this a few times. But I'm going to have a value of type string that is drop down value. Okay, so we have a drop down. We'll also have some cascading drop downs just to show off those. But we'll start off with this. We're going to start off with a string. And I'll kind of work you through why it is a string and not like an int for an ID or something else. So now let's create a form to handle these different types. So we'll go to pages and we'll create a new page. And we'll call this the sample. I think sample form is probably good. And then what we'll do, one more thing we need to do, we need to create that folder. I don't know why I didn't create it already. We need to create a folder for models and move in that sample model. Again, not sure why I put it here instead of under models, but there we go. Hit OK and change the namespace to .models to match the folder it's in, which does mean I need to add the imports. I'm going to say using Blazor app.models. All right, so now in here, we can start working with that model. And let's do this. Let's split the screen so we have the list of our, let's do it the other way. Let's do it left to right. So let's open up our model again. And we're going to split the screen vertically. There we go. And I'll unpin this and we'll move this over just enough to give us a little bit of space. So you can kind of see what's going on here. So there we go. So there's our different types: sample int, sample double, sample bool, sample date, and drop down value. Now let's create a form that works with all of these. So we're going to create an edit form. And now that we have the edit form, we can start adding to it. So let's start with our, well, you know what? We need to add one more property up here. Let's make this big again. There we go. And we need to add one more property. And this is a string, but this is going to be sample password. Forgot that type. So let's add that. That way we can see it. And the scroll bar is not showing up at the bottom for some reason, but that works. So let's create a password first. So input text, and this is going to be, oh, we need to bind this first. So let's create a private sample model and call it sample is fine, equals new sample model. And then we'll bind the model and say the, oops, not at, just model equals, there's our at sample. And now we can say input text and bind value is going to be on sample dot, this is going to be a sample password. Okay, so now we have a sample password field. And if you're familiar with HTML, you'll know that a input box can be a password field by just saying the type is password. Well, that's all we need to do for input form. Say type equals password. Now, this is not something that sample or that input text has by default on it. But what happens is if there is an attribute that is not applied to input text, it gets dropped into the final version of the control, which is going to be an input control. So this is going to be passed on to our input control. So that's now a password input, which means it's not going to show us the value when we're typing it. Now let's deal with those numbers. So input number, and this is going to be bind value on sample.sampleInt. And then we're going to do the same thing again, but this time it's going to be on sample double. So it's the same input number, but one's an int and one's a double. And we'll see how those two are reflected in the user interface. Because really, that's all you need to do. Even though one can only take whole numbers and one can take fractional numbers, both will work just fine. Okay, let's do a checkbox. So input checkbox, and this is for the Boolean, bind value. You've already seen this once, but I want to make sure I cover it again. Sample bool. All right, so there's our checkbox. And now we have a date. Input date. Bind value equals sample.sampleDate. Not double. Sample date. There we go. Like so. And that's all we need so far. But now let's create our last one, which is that drop down. And we'll create a couple of these, but this is the first simple one. All right. So you have a select field, and we're going to say, oops, not select, input select. There we go. And we're going to bind the value equal to sample.dropDownValue. Okay. And then in here we can say option value equals empty string, and then say select item, like so. And then we can have option value equals, oh, I don't know. Let's do numbers, even though they're going to be strings that they're stored as. And the first one is going to be simple option. And then we'll have another one. In fact, let's copy and paste these. You don't need to watch me continue to type this. Simple option, this is going to be complex option, which is number 2. And we'll have one more, which is going to be very complex option. And that's our input select. Okay, so these are going to be string values, the actual value. So when you select simple option, it's going to store a number 1 string in the drop-down value. Okay, now I'm emphasizing really clearly here, these are strings, because the way that the input select works right now with Blazor, it does not convert over integers. So if you want to have an integer, it won't convert it. If you have a enum, it will convert it to an integer just fine. But if you have a regular int, it will not work yet. So the suggestions are to override it and do some other things. I'm going to show you some simple ways to handle it, and then you get to choose what works best for your situation. Okay, but let's start off with the basics. So this is our form. This is what we've got. We've got a little bit of everything going on here. It's not laid out real well right now. In fact, let's put breakpoint or breaks after each one, just to have a little bit of spacing here. Again, not ideal. Whoops. Not ideal form layout. But this will work. Okay. So this is a sample form. Let's go ahead and open up our Solution Explorer and go to our navigation. And this is a sample form, which we haven't created the path for it yet. But we can call it sample form. We'll call it sample form. And let's see if there's not a form, so let's again just phone. Close enough. All right. And let's give this a page so we can actually go to it. At page is sample form. All right. So now we're going to try this out and see how this whole form works. All right. So sample form. The first one is a password box. So if I type in test, notice it's just the dots. And then the next one is an integer box. So let's put a value of 1 in here. That's fine. If I put a 1.25 in here and tab off it, it goes red immediately because that's not okay. All right, you've got to have a whole number. The next one can take a whole number, but it can also take a fractional number, and it's still fine. Checkbox works just fine. Our date picker, it starts off with a value of 1/1 of year 1 because that's what our date defaults to. We can change that if you wanted to, but I can choose to say today's date. And this is the standard Blazor date picker. You can bring your own into this if you want. You could try out a different one, but right out of the box, you have something that works, and you can also fill it in manually. Find a drop-down item. We have simple option, complex option, very complex option. That all works. So let's talk through this last one, which is our drop-down. In a database, typically, when you're dealing with a drop-down, what you'll have is an ID value and a string representation of that ID value. So you may So that's a possibility. But another option is to change this to a select box instead of an input select. And then instead of saying bind value, what you would do is set the on change. And the on change, you could process that value and say, is it an int or not, or what this int is, and put that int in the model as necessary. So we're going to do that in just a minute because we're going to do cascading dropdowns. This is one of those things that is often asked about, is how do you do cascading dropdowns in pretty much every user interface out there? And for the most part, cascading dropdowns aren't a difficult thing, but it does depend a little bit on not using input select. Now you can create your own that overrides or extends input select and do your own work with it. But I'm going to do what's built into Blazor, and we'll see how to do cascading dropdowns. So let's create a new model. And let's call this Cascade Model. And this model is going to be pretty simple. We're going to have an ID for first ID, and I have another one called second ID. All right. And what these are is the first dropdown, we're going to get the ID back from that value, so that the number, and notice it's an int. And then based upon that first one selected, we're going to get the second integer, get that value back, and put it in from a second dropdown. Okay? This will make it be clear in a minute. All right? So what we'll do now is and let's go through our list here. We'll go a shorter version. Let's do chat. All right. And now we have a link to our cascade. Let's go ahead and wire up this form. Now to do this, we're going to have two lists of key value pairs. So a number or an ID, and then a value, which is that the text we show the user. So in our sample form, we had just manually put 1, 2, and 3, and we had our text to display. So the user sees this value, but the value being stored is this value, which is the ID, which usually databases are more happy with numeric IDs instead of text, because it's much easier to match up on. So that's what we're going to do here. Now, to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two dictionaries. Because a dictionary is just a key value pair system. So we're going to have int with a key, and the value will be string. Like so. And we'll call this, let's go with media types equals new dictionary. And then we're going to have another dictionary that's going to be the same type of thing. That's going to be subtypes. And what that'll be is, so media types is going to be movies, TV shows, books. All right, those are the media types. And then if you select, let's say, books, you're going to get a list of subtypes like the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy and so on down the list of books. And yes, I've read more than 2 books. But the same thing is true for movies. You select the movies, and you're going to get Top Gun and, well, hey, The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. That's all I watch on movies too. But that's what you're going to get. So it's going to change based upon your first selection. That's what a cascading dropdown is. So let's start off with populating this media types. I'm going to create a constructor because that's the very, very beginning, and that's going to populate this media types since we're not getting it from a database. We're just going to manually do this. So we're going to say media types dot add, since I've already initialized it right here. And I'll say value of 1, and we're going to say movies. And I'll duplicate this line, and we'll do 2 and 3, and this will be TV shows, and this will be books. Okay? So those are our 3 types in media types. Now this will correspond to our dropdown. So let's start with that first dropdown. So we're going to create a edit form, and we'll say model equals cascade. Whoops, let me put an at in front of that. And now inside here, that's our private model. Remember, our cascade is just 2 IDs, the first ID and second ID. So the first ID will be one of these 3, movies, TV shows, or books. And the second ID will correspond to whichever one is selected. All right, so let's start with our select. Notice it's not an input select, it's a select. And we're going to say at on change, and we'll say handle first drop down change. Okay, something like that. Now we don't have this yet, so we'll create this. Private void, and this is going to be handle first drop down change, and we'll have the change events RE. All right, so that's going to be our handler for this select changing. So whenever it changes, we're going to populate or call this with this value having allowed to identify what the value was it changed to. Okay, we can't have bind value here because you can't have bind value and on change. Can't have both. And bind value doesn't work anyways because we're in a select, we're not in an input select. Okay, so now inside here, we'll start off with our default option first. Option value equals, let's say 0. Actually, you know what? Nope, it's going to come through as a string, so that's okay. We're going to come through with an empty string, and we will say that the value says select. This is our media type. Select media type, something like that. And then we're going to do a for each loop. For each, and we're going to say M in to string dot length. Actually, you know what? We're going to wrap as a string. I always do this in reverse order. String dot is null or white space, like so. Then we're going to return. We don't want to do anything if they selected an empty value. Okay. We might want to, you know what we're going to do? We are going to change cascade dot first ID equal to 0, and let's set the cascade dot second ID to 0 as well. So if they select something that doesn't have a length, that means they've selected our default right here, which means they haven't actually made a selection, which means we should wipe out the first ID, that's 0, which 0 is not typically a valid ID number. And then we also wipe out the second one because you can't have a second one selected if the first one isn't selected. And we're going to return. However, if it does have a value, then what we're going to do is we're going to convert this to an integer. So cascade.firstID equals int.parse and that value. They may say, Tim, why aren't you doing a try parse here? And the reason why is because I control which elements go into this list. So there's only ever going to be IDs here, numbers. Therefore, it will always parse. If it doesn't, something has massively gone wrong, and I do want this thing to blow up. I don't want to gracefully fail from this and say, oh, it's no big deal, because there's something really wrong if your IDs aren't numbers when you expect them to be. So, therefore, we're going to do a try parse, and we'll put that value in first ID. Now that we have a value in first ID, what we can do is we can populate second ID, or a second list. So right now we have subtypes are empty. So, and actually, you know what? We should probably do this as well. Let's clear out that subtypes list if they select an empty list. So we're going to say switch on cascade.firstID. And then let's do number 3. And that will be Star Wars. A travesty, number 3, but that's what it is. All right, now refer to it A New Hope, just in case you're a geek and you're wondering. All right, case number 1. Case number 2. Let's fix that spacing. So number 2, we would have, let's say 4, 5, and 6 instead of 1, 2, 3, because your IDs would be different. You wouldn't have a same ID for different subtypes. So therefore, this is going to be for TV shows. All right, let's start with an oldie, The Pretender. And then we'll go with Warehouse 13. And finally, Eureka. Okay, great TV shows. And then we'll have a case for number 3, which is books. So we'll do 7, 8, and 9. And for number 7, Finish by John Acuff. If you haven't read it yet, read that book. It's amazing. It will help you a lot. Number 8, let's go with, how about Linchpin? And that's by Seth Godin. Good book to check out. And finally, The Phoenix Project. And that's another good book to check out as well. Of those 3, check out Finish first. Okay, so there's our 3 different cases. So depending on which one you choose, it determines which value you get. Now let's do this. Let's wipe out the list in the default and put nothing in there just in case somehow I get to that, which you should not. But this is going to give us our second list of values. Okay, so when you select a first one and it's not null, then we're going to get that ID. And then based upon that ID, that's going to populate the subtypes list. Well, let's show that subtypes list. So we're going to have an if, and it's going to be subtypes dot count is greater than 0, meaning there's something in the subtypes list, which there only ever will be if you've got something selected for your first list. So if there's something in the subtypes list, then we're going to do basically the same thing we're doing here. So let's just copy and paste this. And we'll call this handle second dropdown. And let's make sure you actually put this in place. So let's put it right above so I can see what I'm doing. Private void handle second dropdown, change event args e. And in here, what we'll do is we're going to make sure it's not, we'll do the same thing as here. Is null or white space. If it is, then just put a 0 there. And don't wipe anything out. Actually, you know what? Don't change anything. Just leave it alone. Just return is all. But the second ID gets the value if it is a value other than an empty string. All right? So we have our select subtype. And sometimes subtype's not the right word probably. Select value maybe, or select, I don't know. But that's what we're doing. We're calling it subtype. That's fine. So subtypes. So for each let's be consistent and do S. So you have to change it manually since my control dot's not working right now. I think maybe, nope, we don't have the ability to refactor yet. But for S in subtypes, S.key and S.value. So let's see this in action. Let's run this. It's on a Cascade demo page. I'm not sure if I put the link in, I forget. I believe I did, but we'll see if Tim remembered. I did, awesome. So we got the media type. Movies. Subtype, Top Gun, Die Hard, or Star Wars. But if I choose TV shows, I have Eureka the Pretender and Warehouse 13. Now, I do have a problem. Eureka was already chosen because I had chosen in movies Star Wars, which is the last value. I don't want to do that, so let's go ahead and tweak this, where what I'll do is I will, whenever something is selected, I'll wipe out the other values. So right here, I'll say cascade.secondID equals 0. That should take care of that problem. Let's make sure. So I'll run this again. And we'll go here, we'll select movies, I'll select Star Wars. Select TV shows. It's still saying Eureka, so you make sure we get that fixed. Now, I've done some research on this, and it's a little bit more complicated than really I would like. There seems to have been a bug that might still be a bug where it's not looking at the new values for these dropdowns. So if I select TV shows, notice how it's Eureka, the last one, and books is the Phoenix Project, also the last one. If I were to select the middle one, Linchpin, then the middle one of movies, which is Die Hard, gets selected, and the TV show Warehouse 13, also the middle one. So what's happening is it's remembering the position of the previous selection, even though the selection is different. And that's not really ideal. Now, it's supposed to be that it respects things like selected or redoing, but it's not at this point doing that. So here's what we're going to do to resolve this. And there's a number of different ways we can do this, by the way. So it's not just this is the only way, but this is the way that I think works for this situation. It might not work for your situation. So it may be that what you need to do is use a little bit of JavaScript to redo this, so that once this changes selection, you would just tag this and say, hey, refresh this to the first value. But I think the way we're going to do this is It's a little tricky, but I think we'll get there. And this is actually a great time to learn this. So let's close this out, and we're going to start working on making this work by actually calling a little bit of JavaScript, which it can be a little scary and can be a little quirky, but I think that the result will be exactly what we want. Okay, let's start by adding a little bit of JavaScript. Now, if you're not familiar with JavaScript, don't worry, we're not going to go too deeply into it, but we do have something we want to tweak, and that is this select box right here. In fact, let's give us an ID. We're going to give us an ID of second, let's call it the second dropdown. All right, so now we can look up this select box factors, but really, if you're just using jQuery for selection, then you probably don't need jQuery. This is the pure JavaScript, no second, no third-party libraries, no other scripts needed way to select something. So get element by ID, and we called this the, I believe, secondary dropdown. Is that what we called it? Or second dropdown. I'll copy that and paste in there. Notice the single quotes, not double quotes. That's the typical JavaScript way of using strings. So let's do that. So get element by ID, second dropdown, and we're going to say selected index equals 0. What that's going to do is it's going to set the selected index. So when you have a dropdown, these are indexed. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way down, as in JavaScript, okay? So this is not the value we're talking about. This is the index or ID of the actual item. So we can refer to it, the selected index of 0, which is the very, very first element, which is a select subtype. We can talk to this by saying dot selected index, and we're going to set that value to 0. That way it's going to change that selection up to the very top. So now that we have this JavaScript, let's figure out how to call this. So you have reset second dropdown. This is a method. Out where we want to call this. I think we want to call this in the handle first drop-down change. Okay, but let's make this async task instead of void, which will still work just fine, or it should work just fine with this as it is. But now we can call async methods. At the very top, what I'll do is I'm going to say JS runtime, actually await JS runtime dot invoke async, and we'll call this a type object. I'm going to talk about this in just a minute, and we'll say call the reset second dropdown, and we'll pass in a new object array of size 0. So What this is doing is it's calling the JS runtime's invoke async. So it's going to invoke some JavaScript. In this case, we're going to invoke this method, reset second dropdown. And the return type, we don't have one, so we're just going to say object is fine. And these are the parameters to pass in, which I don't have any. Therefore, I'm just passing in really nothing. I could also pass in, if I wanted to, a new object like this. That's fine as well. Now what this will do is it will reset our second dropdown and say the selected value, selected index item is this one right here, which is always present. Now let's also move out these two right here. They should always be reset whenever we are whenever we're changing the value for our first dropdown. The second dropdown and subtypes should all be reset. So that was a kind of a quirk or a problem, the first one. So that I think should be all we need, but let's try it and make sure it works. All right, so we're going to run this and test to see if we're going to call our JavaScript properly. And we can talk through a little more. The exception is cannot set property selected index of null. Let's just look at this item right here, and it is called second dropdown, so it should find it. All right, so let's find out why it's not being set properly. The first thing to do is make that script a little more robust. So we're going to say this right here. We're going to say if is not equal to null, then like so. I believe my JavaScript's a little rusty, but I believe that will work. It's going to do a null check first. Pretty much to anybody to use. You can restrict it if you want. I don't think it's necessary right now. So we'd probably put this in its own JavaScript file and then just refer to that JavaScript file here. But either way, we have this function, and it's called reset second dropdown. Now, we had a little bit of problem with just trying to do it immediately because sometimes they'll get called when the second dropdown does not exist because it's not being shown, and therefore we're having that null issue. So it's not null check here. Just make sure that it's not null. And if it is not null, then we can go ahead and set the selected index. So by doing this, this will get run anytime the first dropdown has been changed. it's going to reset the value of a second dropdown to be 0. Okay? So a little bit more complicated to get cascading dropdowns to work, but it also does highlight how we can use JavaScript or drop into JavaScript if we really need to fill in a gap with Blazor. So the gap we had was that it just wasn't updating properly. Now over here in our cascade, I had to put this at the end, this JavaScript invoke, because of the fact that this is after we've made all these changes. So I'm now doing it at the end, but that's going to reset this select. Okay? So now that's how you do a cascading dropdown. If you had multiple, what you could do is you could pass in via parameter to this. You could pass in which dropdown to reset. And then it reset whatever dropdown you told it to. And that might be a good option as well, where you're saying, okay, this is the dropdown to reset, because you could have multiple dropdowns like this, and they could all cascade off of each other. So that's definitely a possibility. All right, but that's a cascading dropdown. The first dropdown, you select a value, and based upon that, you get the second dropdown. Now, one other thing to note here is that just remember that even though we can't get the numeric value directly using the input select type, because we're using the onChange, we're getting that value. So we're doing the parse right here, and we're getting the int. So just because the input select doesn't work with integers out of the box, except for enums, at least right now it doesn't mean you can't use them. It just means you do things a little bit differently. Okay, so that's it for this lesson. We've covered how to do quite a few different types in our sample form, including different types of numbers, checkboxes, date, a date selector, and also a select box, and different ways of handling that. And they also dealt with some more complexities with something like a cascading dropdown, where we have to have one dropdown change its values based upon another and make sure that our reset works properly. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff you can do with Blazor, and if you have to, you can even jump into JavaScript to help you out and kind of round out some corners you might have. Okay, so a lot you can do. There's a lot also to practice here. So I definitely encourage you to try out some different forms. Think through what forms you have to use, either at work or in your personal life, or forms you've seen, and try and recreate them and see how you would do the different types. Make sure you can validate them. Make sure that the data coming through can be displayed properly, and that you can capture that data out properly. Okay? So try that out, and once you've practiced this, come on back for the next lesson.